So my name is Brooke Edmonds. I'm with OSU Extension, and I've been coordinating the Master Gardener Advanced Training webinars. So these are for Oregon Master Gardeners, but then any Master Gardeners across the U.S. or interested public is welcome to join in on these. So I'm really happy today to have Kaci Buhl come back and be our speaker today. So a little bit about Kaci. So she's an associate professor here at Oregon State University, and she coordinates the statewide pesticide safety education program. Kaci is also the deputy director of a national pesticide educational resources collaborative, which creates pesticide manuals, exams, and other resources for professionals in the field. She studied IPM at Michigan State University and previously coordinated the National Pesticide Information Center, which Master Gardeners, you might be familiar with this resource. So I'm going to have Kaci go through and share her screen and take it away. And again, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We'll have some time in the presentation to answer questions, and then again at the end as well. All right, so I'm going to mute myself and let her take it away. Thanks, Kaci.
Absolutely. Thanks. It is such an honor to have so many of you registered. I think we had over 200 registered this morning, and about 160 so far have signed on. I want to make the most of your time. Brooke's already let me know that you're already Master Gardeners. You're already in a master class. So I've really tried to build a presentation that will give you things that you haven't heard before. So that's what we'll be focusing on today. I also wanted to mention there's a lot of great ways to manage weeds without herbicides, but that's not what I'm going to be focused on today. I understand you've had other speakers that covered those topics. So we're going to really dig in about the herbicides today and hopefully give you a lot of great information. So let's go. First, it's important to remember anytime we talk about pesticides, and anytime we talk about them, I have to remind folks that the label is the law. And that is not just true for professionals, but it's also true for homeowners. Even when we use our repellents at home and other types of pesticides that are very familiar, those have legally enforceable pesticide labels. So I'm not going to try to tell you exactly how to use things because you have to look at each individual label and follow those instructions, but I'm going to give you a lot of tips and tricks for what to expect. Always be cautious when you're applying pesticides and know that it is your legal responsibility as the applicator. You could be held liable for injury or damage that may result from any pesticide use, including herbicides. All right. Next, you may hear me slip back and forth between saying herbicides, that's the focus of our talk today, and pesticide. Pesticide is an umbrella term. You Master Gardeners definitely understand this very well, that pesticide is that umbrella term that includes all of the antimicrobials, avicides, defoliants, desiccants, obviously the herbicides, and lots of other things. So a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today is applicable across that spectrum, but I'll keep it focused on herbicides. Now, I guess I have a question for you that if you're in a group, or maybe even if you're in a room all by yourself, you could also answer this question. Do you think these are pesticides? Well, yes, they are. Very often I've had questions from folks at events that I speak at, or even on Ask an Expert, where they say, you know, I'd like to avoid using pesticides, so I think I'll just mix something up for my kitchen. As soon as you do that, and mix something up for the purpose of controlling a pest, it is a pesticide. And some of those mixtures we can make from the chemistries in our own kitchen can be more toxic and less studied than the kind of things that you might buy in the store, which are required to go through a thorough risk assessment before they're allowed to go on the market, especially when we talk about things like vinegar, bleach, salt. They can have very different effects in different concentrations, and some of them be very unanticipated. So yes, those do count as pesticides. And I'll remind you, as Master Gardeners, this is the OSU policy for Oregon State University, but I think it's similar to policies around the nation for Master Gardeners, is that we recommend the least toxic control methods that are research-based and shown to work. And as a representative of a Master Gardener organization, we also are barred from making recommendations to do things that are illegal. That stuff we just saw in the previous slide, like these mixtures you might see on Pinterest or places like that, that's an action. If we were to recommend that, that would be an illegal recommendation, unfortunately. So even if you've tried something like these recipes and they've been effective for you, there may be unknown risks that we don't know about because it hasn't gone through a risk assessment process. So I'm going to discourage any references to those kind of pesticides because it's just strictly illegal. Let's stick with the things that have been evaluated for the marketplace, or those things that have been exempt from the requirement for registration, those things like minimum risk pesticides. More on that later. All right. Another note just about our conversation today. I've had a lot of conversations about herbicides lately, and sometimes they can get pretty contentious. So I'd like to just start off ahead of time and let you know I'm not going to tell you what to do in your situation or tell you what to recommend for others. I think what our job is as educators, and that includes you as master gardeners, your educators, is to give people the information they need to make their own decisions. Some people may choose to use herbicides. Some people may choose not to use herbicides, and folks may feel very strongly about their decisions. We need to coexist with each other in a learning and growing environment. And so there might be information that you need or don't need in the presentation today, but I hope you can listen with open ears. It'll make you a better consultant as a master gardener to be more familiar with all of the topics in the wide range. All right. I wanted to show you just in general some of the things that your constituents have probably seen online. DIY stump remover, homemade bug killer, homemade weed killer. These are all over the place on the internet, and they actually multiply on social media, unfortunately. I put a big circle slash through it because I'm not promoting this approach. As we just talked about, it can be more dangerous than the things that are evaluated for use at home. We'll go into more detail on salt and soap and vinegar later. So we're going to dig in and let you make up your own mind. But I will say, as a master gardener, it's not legal for us to recommend these kind of homemade products. All right, moving on. Brooke told you that I majored in IPM. My master's degree is in IPM, Integrated Pest Management from Michigan State University. And before we jump into herbicides, I just couldn't get by without reminding everyone of the IPM steps for weeds. Identify your weeds down to the species, especially if you have a problem weed that's recurrent year after year, or a really persistent weed that doesn't get controlled by the methods that you use to control others. If you have a problem weed, identify it. Get it identified. There's great tools available, which I'll go over in this presentation, and learn about its life habits, its needs. Maybe you'll find out that it can't tolerate shade and you could actually give it some more shade somehow. Those kind of things. Take steps to exclude and remove that weed from the area. Try to change the microclimate to discourage that particular weed if possible. You can change the temperature by opening up the canopy. You can change the amount of sunlight by deciding what you're going to put next to that problem spot. Corn, perhaps, to shade things out, or some other choices. Find out how it spreads. Whether it's seeds or rhizomes makes a big difference in how you're going to try to interrupt the spreading process. And make sure to identify a wide range of options before you go ahead and choose something. And always, when you're making choices about pest control, minimize your impact on the environment. That's very important because disturbances can actually favor weeds. A lot of weeds have evolved to be very fast at invading disturbances. So the less we disturb the garden environment or the yard environment, the less likely those invasive weeds, those really quick starter weeds, will take hold. All right, now as you're choosing an herbicide, it's very important to think about target specificity. Some things, well, let's go over the selective ones first. The most common type of selective herbicide that's used in the garden and landscape are things that kill broadleaf plants, but they're tolerated by grass species. When I say tolerated, it's kind of like a rain-resistant jacket. You know, it's resistant, but not all the way resistant. And certainly if you're caught in a downpour, a rain-resistant jacket is not going to do it for you. That's the same case with these herbicides. They're tolerated by grass species, but a high enough dose can definitely harm grass species if you don't follow the label directions. So those are popular in turf and areas like that. There are also some other ones available that kill grassy species, but they're tolerated by broadleaf plants. And I put some examples down there. You can see in the examples I've selected, these are active ingredients. So you won't see these names as like a product name, but when you get into the store where you're looking at your herbicide options, look at the active ingredients. It's usually on the front panel of the product. If it's not, it'll be on the back panel with a percentage, so you can see which products fall into each of these categories. Non-selective weed killers, they don't care at all. They will kill plant tissue on contact, and some of the most popular herbicides are in that category, and that would include glyphosate. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup. It's pretty famous. You've probably heard about it in the news, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it today because it's one of the most controversial and also one of the most commonly used herbicides available in the home market. Paraquat bears mentioning because it is highly toxic, especially when ingested, even in tiny, tiny amounts. Paraquat is not typically available for the home and landscape market, but it's very often used in agriculture because it's so good as a burn-down herbicide. Just one to be aware of, that paraquat is probably not one that you want to have around the house if you have kids, pets, anyone that, or, just risky scenarios. It's a very, very toxic herbicide. And moving on. So as master gardeners, I'm sure you know this, but I thought I'd put up a picture just for those people who might be listening in with less expertise. A grassy species has parallel veins. And you notice they kind of go in that up and down, and they don't cross. But over on the broadleaf side, you see a lot of branching like this. So when you look at your herbicide label, if it says it targets broadleaves, these are the kind of plants that it will target. Those are in different phylums. Not phylums, they're in different groups taxonomically, so they're significantly different enough that different herbicides can work on each of those different plant types. All right, now in picking the right weed killer, you also need to look at the label to see whether one of these words comes up, the pre-plant, pre-emergence, or post-emergence. I think the one I look for on labels the most is the pre-emergent, and that's exactly how they state it. So pre-plant would be like doing site preparation. If you wanted to, take everything down, clear it off. There's, of course, a lot of great ways to do that, to clear a piece of land of unwanted vegetation. For example, putting down black plastic and holding that down with heavy stones or bricks over a period of several months. You can encourage those seeds in the seed bank to germinate, and then they won't have enough access to light, and then they'll die. So there's a lot of great ways to do that. But sometimes when it's a huge area, for example, a couple of acres that you want to clear off and make a new yard, then glyphosate or other pre-plant herbicides might be a more economical choice. Pre-emergence, those herbicides work in such a way that they make a layer on the surface of the soil that kind of serves as a barrier. So when a seed in the soil germinates and it starts pushing that really sensitive little crookneck sized thing up to the soil surface, when it encounters that layer of pre-emergent herbicide, it's very susceptible at that time in its life and can be prevented from penetrating through the soil surface. And a post-emergent, obviously you already have weeds and then you want to kill those. There's plenty of options on the available for that as well. Now, if you have an established stand of weeds that you want to attack with herbicides, of course, I'm in Oregon, so I always think of blackberries. Blackberry bushes are invasive and very prolific in Oregon, and an established stand can really take a piece of your land away. So there are other active ingredients for an established stand, and you can imagine the physiology, looking at that picture at the bottom, the physiology of what's going on in those plants at each stage, from germination to being a tiny little seedling to starting to have its first true leaves. The physiology of what's happening in those plants are different at different stages, so it makes sense that different herbicides might be useful at different stages. You really need to check the label on this, because even post-emergence herbicides very often will have something on the label that says this is really effective on these weed species before they're 4 inches tall, or before they're 6 inches tall, or before they're 2 inches tall. So the timing makes a huge difference. And for different species, different things on the label. So you're probably noticing I'm referring you back to the label again and again, because that's where the really authoritative, great information is available. All right, so pre-emergence herbicides, this is actually one of the times of year that pre-emergence are often used, either a fall application or a late spring application. Pre-emergence are handy in things like driveways or in a beautiful bed like this when they might be using pre-emergent herbicides on those bare pieces of ground to keep them nice and bare and looking clean. A pre-emergent herbicide might be something you consider for a space like that. All right, now I'm still on the topic of choosing an herbicide, and I want to refer you to some of the great tools that we have here in the Pacific Northwest. They're available nationwide, of course, but you may even have tools on your own extension websites that go further. Here in the Northwest, pest management handbooks. All you have to do is Google for that or use one of your favorite search engines. Pest management handbooks or PNW handbooks. Come up here to the weed section and you see there's a wide range of things available for master gardeners. I would focus right here on horticultural weed management. And when you get there, there's some great information that includes really detailed information for year-round weed management, preventative tactics, very much encouraged because you can use a lot less herbicide proactively than you would need after stands are established. Management tactics and resources for homeowners and landscapers. Included in that link is even a list of active ingredients that you might consider using that are legal, registered for the appropriate uses around the home, garden, and landscape, but there are so many available. I hesitate to even put up a list, but it is available at that link if you'd like to see the list. And I think it's often even more useful just to go to the store where you want to buy your purchase, your herbicides, and see what they have available. Bring your smartphone with you so you can do a little bit of research as you go, because very often if you do your web research on what you want to buy, you may end up having to buy online, or they just don't have that specific thing you picked out at your local hardware store or big box store. So see what you have available and choose between those options. There's also a really neat widget on our P&W handbooks where you could pop in a weed, a problem weed right here, and it'll bring up documents where that is mentioned. All right, now as you're selecting herbicides, I encourage you to think about potential resistance. And this also goes for, as master gardeners, you might be counseling people to pick an herbicide. You might get a call from someone who said, you know, I've always used this herbicide and it stopped working. Well, that could be because you always used that pesticide, that specific herbicide. The recipe for getting pesticide resistance is to use the same thing on the same plant stand over and over and over again. What happens is that only those resistant individuals will survive, they breed, and pretty soon the whole stand is resistant because you've selected for that. We've applied natural selective pressure. So what they've done in agriculture, and we get to benefit from this in the horticultural world, is the mode of action groups that you see highlighted here. Look at this herbicide family link here, and it'll help you identify for the caller or for yourself. Let's look at some active ingredients that are registered for that same kind of use, but they're not in the same chemical family. If you pick something in a different mode of action family, and these are identified on product labels with letters, so there's group A, group B, group C, then you can hopefully find one that your plants are not already resistant to. If you change to another active ingredient that's in the same family, you're going to have the same results, and then you'll have herbicides that you don't know what to do with because they're not useful for you. So if something's not working, don't bother trying another product in the same group. Consider doing a combination product with active ingredients from more than one group. These are actually pretty common. You can find several herbicides for the garden and landscape that have a list of active ingredients. One of the reasons they do that is to try to manage potential resistance. So having a couple different chemical families means any individual that was resistant to the first herbicide would also have to be resistant to the second one in order to survive the treatment. Now, this can get kind of complicated to dig into. If you're working with a caller, you're always welcome to either call NPIC, which is the National Pesticide Information Center, located here at Oregon State University, but serving a national audience. It's open from 8 to noon on the West Coast, 11 to 3 on the East Coast. That's Monday through Friday, and they can help you dig in a little deeper. And I'm glad I offered you a little place to get help before showing you this slide. It's too small to see, but essentially this is how they've broken it down in the Herbicide Resistance Action Committee. Different herbicides in the same class. So this is a pretty big class, has a lot of different chemistries in it. This one's actually really small and only has a couple of herbicides in it. So this is the kind of tool that NPIC would use to help you select something in a different class, but there's also a lot of great resources online. And I wanted to put this up here. You can zoom in on these. I'm a nerd for this stuff. I think it's really interesting to see what's kind of grouped together and what isn't. Glyphosate is one of those chemicals that actually sits in a chemical family almost all by itself. So picking anything other than glyphosate, if you found that glyphosate stopped working for you, is probably going to be in another chemical class. All right, I'm going to stop for questions here in about a minute, but I wanted to give you some good herbicide resistance avoidance strategies. Use a variety of weed control tactics, not just one. And if you use herbicides, rotate which ones that you use each season or year and select them from different mode of action groups. And don't make herbicide applications at a rate lower than the label rate. What that can do is it allows those marginally resistant individuals, those weeds that are almost resistant but not quite, it allows them to survive and breed, which leads to more resistance. So using the full dose can make sure that all of your your susceptible individuals are killed the first time. All right, with that, I'm going to take a pause, take a breath. I think we're about 20 minutes in, and I want to stop and see if anyone has questions so far.
Too many buttons. So we had one question from Courtney, and so she's just wanting some of the information from this webinar. And so I just want to let everyone know that all the web links that Kaci's mentioning and the recording, this will all get packaged and go out to you. So don't worry about trying to write down all of those links. Let me see. So Jim has a question of going back to the homemade remedy pesticides about boric acid and ants. So boric acid, you can purchase this for a lot of different reasons. Is it illegal to use it, or do you need to basically purchase the one that's labeled for ant control?
Well, as far as when we're making recommendations to the public, we should be focusing on those legal things which have been already evaluated and labeled appropriately. So if you were to buy plain old borax for something that some people would mix with sugar, and it is your choice. Again, I'm not going to tell you what to do and not to do, but when it comes to recommending, we should avoid that, because the borax that you buy for other purposes doesn't have use directions. It doesn't tell you how much might be harmful, any kind of personal protective equipment that you might want to, you might need to wear. It doesn't remind you that this can be very harmful for children. The label directions are severely lacking on those products that are not registered. And there are plenty of products out there registered with boric acid that you'd be welcome to apply according to those label directions. So is it illegal to use it in your own home? No. Is it bad judgment for us to recommend it as representatives of university programs? Yes.
Great. Thanks, Kaci. Mm-hmm. Gail wants to know about using stacked products, so different resistance groups. How does that align with the IPM principle of using only what's needed?
Right. Well, it does align with the IPM principle, because we don't want to use up our tools to the point where we end up using higher toxicity products because we've used up the low toxicity products by inducing too much resistance. So there are options for it. If an individual only can try those single mode of action products and they're working great, then she could stick with that for sure. And that'd be a good IPM approach, but maybe rotate that once in a while with a product that has a different mode of action, so that any selection for resistance is not building up in that population. Now, using a stacked product is probably a better idea when you already have some resistance and you need to manage those additional weeds. So you're adding a second active ingredient to control the resistant population to the first active ingredient. So that's how.
Okay, there's a couple more specific questions on, managing in certain situations or certain plants. So we're going to hold on those questions. If we have time, we'll get to them at the end. But I think it's okay to continue at this point, and if you continue to have questions, put them in the Q&A and we'll sort through them at our next break.
All right, that sounds good. What do you say we talk about glyphosate now? Okay, here we go. I put in a significant chunk on glyphosate because it has been such a controversial topic and so many people in the public ask me about it. I assume, based on our Oregon Master Gardeners experience, that they're getting asked a lot about this too. So let's dig into the science. Again, I'm not going to tell you what to think or what to do, just give you a wide range of information so you can make up your own mind. I put up a slide of this news headline because it really drove a lot of interest in glyphosate. I think the number of questions here at the Center to NPIC increased a lot when this court case came out this summer. This was just from August 2018. And for those who might not be familiar, a judge, well, I think it was a jury actually, a jury awarded a large award to a groundskeeper who had been using Roundup routinely in his work on a school campus, and he had been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. A lot of the calls that came to our summer center after this court case came out were saying, well, I guess the courts have now finally decided that glyphosate causes cancer. We can put that to bed. Well, that is far from the case, and certainly courts are not the place where we normally make those kind of very complex decisions. Another thing that drove a lot of inquiries was late in 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer came out with the determination that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen. And this kind of shook things up because it's at odds with a lot of other risk assessment entities. So to basically boil that down, the difference between the International Agency for Research on Cancer and other risk assessment entities like the EPA is that IARC on the top is doing hazard assessment. They ask the question, can it cause cancer under any circumstances? And that's useful and important, and we need to know that. But usually a chemical risk assessment, and not just at the US EPA, but a lot of other risk assessment entities, including some organizations at the World Health Organization, take another step. They take that hazard assessment and then add to it an exposure assessment. What level of exposure is expected? And is that level likely to result in cancer? After doing that kind of analysis, the US EPA has determined that glyphosate is not likely to cause cancer at the rates that we would expect people to be exposed based on the label directions. Can we assume that everyone is following label directions? Probably not. But it is the law, and it's very important that people do follow those directions. In order to dig in on the science, I need to give you a little refresher course on statistics, because we're going to look at some specific studies about this cancer problem so that you can look at the data and sort of figure out what you think and share with others as a master gardener. So an odds ratio is this number 1. And here's what it means. If there were 4 cancers in the population with exposure and the same amount, 4 cancers in the population with no exposure, then we get 4 over 4 equals 1. So if an odds ratio equals 1, that means there was no effect. Now, if there were 5 cancers in the population with exposure and only 4 in the unexposed population, the odds ratio would be 1.25, and we would interpret that by saying it's a 25% higher risk of cancer with exposure. Everyone with me, I hope? So this is a list of odds ratios. There was a list of chemicals over here on this side, but I took it out. It doesn't matter. What I want you to focus on is how this works with the number 1. Remember, 1.0 means no effect. These red dots are odds ratios, and then they are seated in a line that represents the 95% confidence interval. So the researcher that did this study, for example, said the odds ratio is here, but I'm 95% sure it's between here and here. So for those chemicals that have a line that crosses over the magic number 1.0, we can't reject the hypothesis that there was no effect at all. So when it's red, it strides over that number. We would say for a chemical like this, it's leaning toward increasing the risk of cancer. But we can't say with 95% confidence that it's anything that it had an effect at all. So a chemical like this one that comes all the way over and does not cross over the number 1.0, we would say that increased the risk of cancer by a certain amount. 1.65 would be a 65% increase. And a chemical like this one that's all the way on the left side, then we would say that lowered the risk of cancer. All the rest of them are kind of striding over this line. All right, now let's look at some data for glyphosate. This was compiled by Andrew Niss, who's at North Dakota State University, and he compiled a whole lot of different studies that were actually, some were involved in the IARC assessment, some were not. And so you can see this is a list of different types of cancer: brain cancer, oral cancer, rectal cancer, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And just looking at this line, you can see the magic number 1 is highlighted. For some of these, glyphosate exposure decreased the risk of cancer, and for some it increased. But you know, for a chemical with no effect at all, you would expect there to be kind of a smattering right around the number 1, some a little high, some a little low, because science isn't perfect. But this one sure does look compelling, doesn't it? Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma has all of these blue dots, and they lean heavily to the right. And some of them significantly over here to the right. This is a logarithmic scale, so it goes 0.1 times 10 to this point, times 10 to this point, like the Richter scale and other logarithmic scales, it goes up a lot. So this is the kind of suggestive evidence that would make us look a little deeper, that maybe there is something here. So all of these studies are related to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, different studies this time, all related to glyphosate. And here are their confidence intervals. They sure look like they're leaning heavily to the right. So this is the kind of data that makes us take a pause and look a little harder. What's actually happening in the real world population. Each of these are epidemiological studies where they basically look at a population of exposed individuals and see how they fared, how likely they were to get cancer or not to get cancer. There is one study that is absolutely huge. It's called the Agricultural Health Study, and you can look this up online. It's been going on for over 20 years, and they've been following pesticide applicators in the agricultural setting, and they've been able to get really granular data about how much each individual in this study, over 20 years, over 50,000 applicators, how much they were exposed to glyphosate. So in that study, these are the different groups of exposed individuals, the least exposed to glyphosate and the most exposed to glyphosate. And remember, 20 years, 50,000 applicators. This has more statistical power than any of the studies we saw on the previous slide. And what this tells me is that there is suggestive evidence that glyphosate could increase the risk of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. But in a real-world scenario, where folks are exposed to the most glyphosate, this is the 75% high and up percentile, we actually see it's leaning to the left and with a slightly protective effect. So I'm not sure what to make of that, except I'll tell you some of the thoughts I have is that the folks who use glyphosate, it really well represents agriculture because it's such a popular herbicide. Anyone you talk to in agriculture and forestry probably uses some glyphosate, but that means this is looking at a population of all agriculture. So what else in agriculture might they be exposed to? Because it doesn't look like glyphosate specifically is causing this increase for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It could be more sunlight, more dust, more diesel fuel, fertilizers. I think it needs more investigation, but this is a pretty compelling graph to me to see with the most statistical power that they're leaning to the left in this case. Now, EPA did their draft risk assessment. It actually took them 2 years to complete it. They really dug in, especially after the IARC, that group from the World Health Organization, came out with their determination. And what they determined was glyphosate is not likely to be carcinogenic in humans. And that's prefaced in their risk assessment by saying at the rates that we've, currently have approved for use, if PPE is used accordingly. But for those home and garden products, it's not typical for EPA to assume that users will always follow the label directions. So I think that's a wise assumption. It's part of their risk assessment SOPs that they can't assume that same level of label comprehension among users at home. All right, now since 2015, several government entities have gone back to the drawing board and said, now let's reevaluate glyphosate. You just saw what the EPA came out with. I'm sorry, that should say 2017, not 2018, for December 18th, that top bullet. But the European Food Safety Authority, they actually made the determination almost immediately right after IARC made their determination, and the European Parliament told them to go back and do it again, and they actually came out with it again in 2017 and said, we found the same thing, not likely to cause cancer. That's the case in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and another wing of the World Health Organization, which is called JMPR, the Joint Meeting on Pesticide Residues. And so if there's disagreement, and really it's not just disagreement, it's that they do things differently. A risk assessment includes hazard and exposure elements. A hazard assessment, like IARC does not include that exposure piece. So to put that determination in context, the IARC has also put the following items in the same category as glyphosate, which is 2A, probable human carcinogens. This includes red meat, indoor emissions from burning wood, high temperature frying, and late night work shifts. So things that we know can increase the risk of cancer under any circumstances, under some circumstance, but of course, more exposure would equal more risk in those scenarios. This was a infographic that an organization put together to help make sense of this after the IARC determination. They actually put all red meat into the group 2A, probably causes cancer, and all of processed meats like hot dogs and salami and bacon in group 1. That's right alongside asbestos and smoking. So IARC has an approach that's very focused on the hazard. Can it be a hazard or not? It shouldn't necessarily mean that anything in that category is banned, but that we should look at our exposures to those things and try to reduce them to the extent possible. And let's do some more studies, because the preliminary evidence was strong enough to indicate we need to understand more fully what those risks are about. That doesn't mean that, there's other concerns as well. I think this study, this wasn't a study necessarily, but I think a consumer organization took a bunch of cereals off the shelf and tested them to see if they had glyphosate in them, and they found glyphosate more than once. Couple things to say about that. It's not necessarily illegal to find small, tiny amounts of herbicide residue or pesticide residue in cereals. There's actually a product registered for use on oats that's used as a harvest aid. So what they would do is kind of burn down the foliage of the oat crop, which makes it easier to harvest the oats. So when they do that, they have to wait a certain period of time before they go to harvest. And they're subject to market basket surveys like this one. This came out just in October of this year. The first ever FDA glyphosate study found that the weed killer exposure was not concerning for public health. They went so far as to do a specific press release about this one, because there have been so many articles like this coming out. It seems like the public has very little tolerance for Roundup, very little tolerance for glyphosate in general. There's a great big group of people that would like to avoid it altogether, and that's reasonable and prudent, and it's their decision. In order to do that, they could be purchasing cereals that are organic, registered under the National Organic Program, and avoid them altogether, because glyphosate is not allowed to be used in organic settings. And when this says it's the first ever FDA glyphosate study, I'll clarify that just by saying that FDA is checking for pesticide residues in foods every year. They publish their results in something called the Pesticide Data Program. So you can look that up, Pesticide Data Program, FDA, and see some monitoring data. This is the first year that they actually tested for glyphosate, mostly because the laboratory test is super expensive, so it didn't rise to the level. But I'm actually very pleased that enough people spoke up to FDA and said, look, that's the most widely used herbicide in the country. We should be testing for it and checking to see. And they did. And what they found is that they're below the tolerance levels. So There's another piece of news I want to mention about glyphosate, and that is this one about bees. This also came out this fall. The CBS News headline that you see at the bottom is a big exaggeration of what the study actually said. So I'm going to move forward and just share with you. I dug into the study. The study says that glyphosate perturbs the gut microbiota of honeybees, which is important, and we need to understand how that works. But really, anything you put in your mouth or anything a bee puts in their mouth is going to perturb or change the gut microbiota. It might promote some species of gut microbacteria, and it might inhibit other species. So I think they're still trying to figure out what all of this means, but in this study, they used a dose of glyphosate for the bees that was more than 1 million times higher than the dose that you might expect if they were to actually drink from a puddle and get some glyphosate from a recent application. So that was a really high dose, and certainly it tells us something, but I'm not sure it tells us the whole story yet. All right, we just spent 20 minutes talking about glyphosate alone. I hope you didn't think that was a waste of time. I just think it's a really controversial topic and one our master gardeners should know well. So what questions do you have?
Great. So while people sort of formulate that, and then you're going to continue on with a little bit more, Kaci? Okay, great.
Absolutely.
Okay. So Deborah has a question about stickers. Mm-hmm. Do you recommend them? What context? I don't know if you already went over it, but what a sticker is and if they're available for homeowners.
Sure, yeah. I haven't gone over it, and it's not something that I was planning to do. Most of the time, you need to use a sticker when the label tells you that you need to add a sticker. Very often, pesticide labels will require that you use a surfactant. Surfactant, I just use the shortcut in my mind of thinking of a very mild soap solution. So a surfactant can spread, and then another chemical that they might often put into an herbicide formulation is called a sticker, which makes it, after it spreads out evenly on the leaf surface, that it'll stay there instead of just dripping off like you would if you have a normal like light soapy solution or something. It might just drip off. So do we have to use stickers? Not necessarily. Look at your labels to see if they're recommended for the specific products that you're using. Very often stickers are most important for contact herbicides, where it makes a big difference if you contact every part of the leaf surface. But for something that works more hormonally, like 2,4-D or some of the other phenoxy herbicides, it's not as important to get good leaf coverage, just as long as it's getting absorbed into the plant from one place or another. So it depends on the type, and you'd want to look at the label recommendations for each one.
Great. Thanks for the clarification. There's quite a few questions coming in that, again, they would like specific management information, how to control a certain weed. And so we're likely not going to be able to cover those questions in this particular session, but we are keeping note of all of those questions. And so we'll get you some resources. Let's see. So I think it's okay to go on, and then we'll go through the list again at the end.
Okay, sounds good. All right, lots to cover. Here we go. When you're selecting pesticides to dilute or not to dilute, if you choose to buy concentrates, then you're diluting the product into something like a backpack sprayer, something like that. I highly encourage you to keep one sprayer for herbicides and another for insecticides. I've talked to way too many people who used the same sprayer. They thought they cleaned it out well enough, but even just a tiny amount of residue from an herbicide can really hurt plants. If you're spraying with that same sprayer and you're using insecticides or maybe a fungicide, it can really damage your plants. Keep dedicated measuring cups and spoons and do the necessary equipment maintenance. It's really kind of the easy button if you just buy ready-to-use product. So then you're not having to bother with mixing, loading, measuring, and cleaning out that equipment after the fact. Please buy only what you need this season. It can reduce your risk in a lot of different ways. It avoids any uncertainty about the shelf life. If you keep your pesticide chemicals outside in a shed or something like that, extreme temperatures can really have an effect on how they behave. So you can avoid the hassle of disposal and reduce the risk in case of a disaster. Think, for example, about the floods that have taken place recently in our country. Any of those pesticide storage sheds We're also flooded, and some of those chemicals have made it into the flood water where others could be exposed to them. So when you think about your storage area, let's keep it as sparse as possible, just like just-in-time inventory kind of approach. Now, you might be saying and sitting twiddling your thumbs, I only use organic pesticides. All right, let's talk about organic for a little while. First, you should be aware that essential oils can cause allergic reactions, burning eyes, things like that, and they can also be hard on your application equipment. Make sure if you're using these kind of products that are essential oils, they might be clove or others, I'll give you some examples in a bit, that you're rinsing that equipment really well. Very often you require more applications to achieve the same level of control, so it could actually result in higher exposures. You might want to do a little cost-benefit analysis when you're standing in the store and choosing between products. One might be organic, but you have to apply it 5 times in a year. The other one might not be organic, but you only have to use it once. Think about those issues as you're making your plans. Labels may include statements like, use with caution, the toxicological effects of this organic pesticide are largely unknown. I'll tell you, when I first saw that on a label, I thought, man, then why are you putting this in front of me? I would really like for things to be studied before I use them. But some things, if they're already things that we normally eat, like rosemary and things like that, they have been approved without further risk assessment. Now, a statement about buyer beware, all of these symbols that you see in front of you are meaningless marketing. They can say this, no one's going to be able to sue them to say that they were, that's not natural, and you said it was natural, because there's no definition of natural in the Code of Federal Regulations. What there is a definition for is the word organic. So this symbol here on the left, this is the one that you'll see on foods if you want to steer toward organic foods or organic ornamental products that you're buying for your use in your yard. This is the type of symbol you'll see for a pesticide product that has been evaluated for use in organic settings. OMRI is the Organic Materials Research Institute. It's kind of the primary one we see around here in the Pacific Northwest, a national leader in this area, but there are other certifiers. It won't necessarily say this, but it'll say something like it if it's another certifier. Now, if you were searching for pesticides allowed in organic systems, I'm going to go through this quickly because we're almost out of time, but you can always slow down the video, right, and watch it on YouTube later and get more instructions. So search for the Pesticide Information Center online, and I always click the box for Oregon, click the box for Washington, and sort based on OMRI. We just talked about OMRI, the Organic Materials Research Institute. Mark the thing yes. There are 360 products in our state that have been approved for organic production. And then you can narrow it down from there by refining the query. So we refined this to intended users home. I want one of those organic products that you can use at home. We're down to 159 matching labels. In this example, you can say crop equals cabbage or crop equals whatever it is that you're trying to grow. Narrow it down further. And the pest that you're trying to control, in this example, I put in aphids. Submit that query, and you can see how it built, sorry about that, it built a list. All of our things, we got down to 30 products. And with that, you click View Labels, and you can see a whole list of different information about the products that you just searched for. And my favorite part about this database is once you have that list of 30 products, you can export it to Excel so you can play with it, sort it, mess with it. Now, I used that process earlier to build a list of things that are registered for home use for weeds or moss. And I'll show you that list in a minute. Here it is. Yes, organic pesticides for weeds or moss. We have sodium chloride, obviously salt. Have you ever heard that phrase, salt the earth? Yeah, that's a thing. That means you can actually make land unusable in the future by making it too salty. So be careful about using some of these, and of course, only as labels direct. These are all products that have been evaluated, not only for organic production, but also for use in home settings. Now, these are for weeds or moss, and I'm looking at this whole list. These are all essential oils that come from different plants. I've heard results from folks, for example, limonene is a product that's registered for root to control moss on a roof or a sidewalk. But I've heard from folks they have to apply it like every 2 weeks to 3 weeks, or else the moss comes right back. But it is an option. And in certain scenarios where you really want to reduce exposure to conventional herbicides, they might be a great option. But I will caution you that for these, the efficacy is very highly variable. It might work on some things and not others. It might work on one plant stage, but not the very next plant stage. So it's really about being a scientist in your own backyard to try some of these things and see how well they work for you. On the other side over here, we have a couple of different things that are basically mild soap solutions, and they can be especially effective when it's hot. If you can apply that to weeds when it's hot, they're already stressed, maybe they're water stressed as well, you have a higher chance of killing weeds with those soapy type materials. Copper hydroxide uses that copper action, and acetic acid, that's the active ingredient in vinegar. Let's dig in on that one a little bit. There's only 2 products registered in the state of Oregon that include acetic acid as one of the active ingredients. Now this is at 23%. If you use household vinegar, it ranges from, about 8 to 12%. So this is really highly concentrated and has that danger signal word. And it also requires that you wear protective eyewear, such as goggles or a face shield or safety glasses, because it can cause irreversible eye damage. There's only one other product that looks like this. This is the lower concentration with only 8% acetic acid. Still has the same warnings, the same requirement for goggles to be used in order to protect our eyes from permanent damage. So be very cautious when using acetic acid. I know we're getting close to the end of our webinar, so I thought I would stop for questions. I do have some more stuff to go over. If you want me to just blaze on through, Brooke, what do you think?
Yeah, I think you should just go ahead so that we can make sure to cover the content in the time if people have to take off.
All right, excellent. This next section is a lot of best practices that I hope you can pass along as master gardeners to the folks that we serve. Be sure to plan for the best and prepare for the worst. Put this number into your cell phone. It's the number for Poison Center. Secure some access to water before you get started in case there's a spill. That way you have access. Always do your mixing and loading in a well-ventilated area, and keep a bag of kitty litter in the storage area. That's just in case you have a spill and you need to soak it up. If certain things, if you spill them on a concrete floor, concrete, you don't think of it this way, but it is porous. So some of those chemicals can get down into the concrete and stink for ages. So we want to be able to soak it up before it gets all the way down. This will be a handy reference for later if you need to calibrate your hand or backpack sprayer. If you use this size, an 18.5 by 18.5 foot square, so you're measuring out 18.5 feet one way, 18.5 feet the other way, kind of mark it out with flags or with tape or whatever you need to do, then you can do this calculation and it makes the math a lot easier. You time yourself as you spray this area with water, only plain water, uniformly, and you maintain that consistent pressure. Then for the same amount of time, spray into a large bucket, maintaining that consistent pressure. And then when you do that, the ounces collected equals the gallons per acre. And I think this is such a handy tool for calculating your area for a triangle or a circle or a trapezoid and all of your conversions. I just wanted to put this on the screen for you so you can make a screenshot, make a copy for yourself, and I want to give credit to the Montana Department of Agriculture for sharing that with me. Make sure before you get started that you survey the scene, turn off the air intake, close your windows and doors, remove or cover the pet bowls, toys, bird baths. It may sound alarmist, but lower risk, it comes from lower exposure. Be aware of the water table and your soil type. Very important if you have sandy soils versus very heavily organic loam soils. It can make a huge difference in how those herbicides travel through the soil profile. Avoid anything near water or riparian areas. Make sure you're wearing your PPE. If you do use gloves, they should not be made of any absorptive material. Excuse me. If you're going to be walking on the treated area, consider wearing dedicated shoes that won't be used in the house until they're cleaned. One of the biggest ways we track in pesticide residue into the house is on our shoes. So use a pair of muck boots or something like that. Make sure that the kids and pets cannot access the area when you're mixing, loading, or applying. And just a comment too about measuring. Dry ounces, you measure with a scale, you're measuring weight. Fluid ounces, you measure with a cup, you're measuring volume. So those are not the same thing. Make sure that you're differentiating between those when you're using a dry powdery water soluble powder or mixing up a liquid. If you use more than the label says you can, it's actually illegal. And if you use less, it may not even be effective. And remember, it could actually result in more resistance. I'm going to move quickly as we're getting towards the end. Avoid applications to hard surfaces. The herbicides can easily run off, and that's one of the big ways that herbicides make it into our waterways and into our groundwater is when granules from an herbicide product or something like that gets onto an impervious surface and it ends up in the storm drain. Always position yourself upwind whenever possible. And when you're finished, wash your gloves before taking them off. Make sure that you clean up before you do anything with your mouth, and keep your footwear outside. It's always the best practice to just go ahead and take a shower to remove any residues that might have gotten on you while you were working. And remember, if you're sweating and you're taking care of the garden, your pores are opened up, you're more susceptible to having absorption through the skin, and the longer that residue sits on your skin, the longer it has to absorb. So lower exposure, lower risk. Also be aware that herbicides can take a lot of time to kill plants, and that includes glyphosate, 2,4-D, the phenoxy herbicides, sometimes up to 2 weeks. And I've had several questions where people say, you know, I sprayed it a week ago and the weeds are just laughing at me. Well, give it another week, because a lot of those products actually make it impossible for the plant to remake something that it needs, but it has to use up that amino acid first. Pre-emergent herbicides have to maintain a solid layer to work. So if your cat or your dog goes digging around in the flower bed, they've disturbed the surface. So weeds will penetrate that barrier, but only in that spot. Don't necessarily assume that the product's not working at all. It could just mean that somehow that barrier was disturbed. What to do with leftover solution? Please use it up in an approved application site. And if you do store it, its quality could change in unexpected ways. So it's best not to store solution after you've got it already mixed up. Never pour it into the soil, gravel, or turf. Never put it into storm drains or street gutters. The label is actually a great place to look for information about disposal. And if you do have some that you just need to get rid of as hazardous waste, then you can give this number a call and they will help you find a local disposal event in your area. That's nationwide, Earth 911. And just to close up some good best practices, never put any kind of pesticide into a food or beverage container. Just in a 10-year period, the Poison Center reported over 1,400 poisonings that were caused by this. And in that same time period, at least 12 people died as a result of this practice. I think it's especially common among professional gardeners or really hobbyists. They sell pesticides in containers that are way too big. So then somebody says, well, I'll just take a little bit and give it to my friend Bob. Well, then what do you put it in? If you put it in a drink container, it's a loaded gun, just traveling around because some kid's going to pick it up and take a drink. Paraquat's the highly toxic herbicide I mentioned early on in our talk today, and just a sip of that herbicide can kill a person, and it takes 2 weeks to die slowly, and it's not a fun way to die. So please just never, ever, ever take it out of its original container. Give a little bit to Bob, then Bob has to borrow the whole container and give it back when he's done with it. That way, if there's an accident, it's all with its good labeling information for first responders. All right, in closing, if I've gone too fast, covered too many things, or I wasn't able to answer your specific challenge, I hope you'll consider giving a call to one of your local master gardeners. Or for more specific information about pesticides, you can call 1-800-858-7378. This national center is funded by EPA, happens to be located here, but it serves the whole nation. They're not going to make a recommendation for you, but they'll help you compare products, evaluate persistence. They'll help you with confusing label statements and things like that. With that, I will wrap up and take as many questions as we have time for.
Great. Thank you so much, Kaci. So we are right at 12, and so I'll check through the list and see if there's any questions. Again, remember that this webinar will be recorded, and so you'll get notification in a few days, and we'll try to put in all the links and everything, so you'll have all of that information there. And I will also put a plug in for the National Pesticide Information Center. I've used that quite a bit on tricky questions, and they're so helpful. I mean, you're talking to a real person, and they will take time to do the research and pull information back to you. So it was a great resource for master gardeners and the general public to use.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. So there are quite a few like specific management questions, situations that we're not going to be able to cover today, but we'll look through those lists and try to help you out the best we can.
There are a lot of great publications on specific problem weeds. I do encourage you to look for your extension catalog on those specific types and talk to someone local, because resistance is local, and weed problems vary a lot by different parts of the country.
Right. Actually, that was some questions going back to that section on resistance. I think there might be a little bit of confusion. So we had two questions. One from Matthew, who wants to know if there's pesticides that combine all these different classes. Is it possible to create something that's resistant to all of those herbicides? And then Rhonda, sort of a follow-up to that, wants to know about when master gardeners are making recommendations, do we need to recommend two different classes? So I don't know if you could clarify that just a little bit really quickly.
Sure. I'll start with the second one first. As master gardeners, when you're conferring with someone and maybe making a recommendation, resistance won't always come up right away, but if someone mentions that they've been trying something and it stopped working, start thinking about resistance and maybe going to a different mode of action, but not necessarily two at once. If someone's asking you for a recommendation, they make it clear they're going to use the same recommendation year after year. I just need a system so I can do this every spring or every fall. Then you should bring up resistance and encourage them to rotate their products. But no, it's not a general practice to say you need to use two right off the bat. That's not necessarily good IPM, but you can use one at a time and rotate them even just a little bit. Hitting those with a different chemistry once in a while can really achieve that goal for you. And what was the second question, I think? Oh, stacked. Is it possible to have a weed that's resistant to several different chemical classes? Yes, but that resistance builds up one at a time. So there are some populations that have been confirmed to be resistant to 3 or 4, I think is the most I've seen, 3 or 4 different modes of action, but not necessarily all of them. But there are no products that combine all of the different modes of action. It really wouldn't be good IPM to be overdoing it in that fashion. And besides, I mean, this is an arms race. It's very much like antimicrobial resistance or antibiotic resistance, which you might be familiar with from healthcare. It's an evolutionary battle. The plants are going to try something, and then we're going to try something else. They're going to develop some kind of resistance to whatever we try, and then we're going to have to try something else. So we need to let go of the idea that any one strategy is going to be the one, and we can stop evaluating, monitoring, and changing. We're going to always have to evaluate, monitor, and change our tactics.
All right, Kaci, so we're running a little over time, so we're going to go ahead and finish up our webinar today. We're still planning the series for 2019. I'll be releasing some dates soon, but we're going to have a session on sudden oak death for all of you folks down in Southern Oregon, Northern California. This is definitely on your radar. So look for that information soon, and thank you so much, Kaci, and thank you, Mark, for all of your support for our series. We're going to miss you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure working with you, Brooke.
Great. Thanks. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.